The last sunlight was sinking behind the Appalachian ridges when the reporter's truck rattled onto the narrow dirt road, swallowed by trees so dense they felt like walls. He had been on assignments like this before, stories about forgotten towns, dying industries, and people living at the edge of survival, but nothing about this place felt ordinary. The locals in the last town had warned him not to come up here, their voices tightening the moment he mentioned the name he'd heard in hushed conversations, the line. Some refused to speak at all, staring past him as though something in the hills was listening. One old woman had grabbed his hand, her fingers trembling as she whispered that no story was worth what he'd find there. He tried to laugh it off, telling himself mountain superstition was part of the job, but as he drove deeper into the forest, the signal on his phone died, the air grew colder, and even the insects went silent. The quiet pressed against the windows like a living thing. He found himself checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see someone walking behind the truck. But the road was empty, only darkness trailing him. A few miles in, he spotted the remnants of a rusted sign bent backward, the letters barely readable under layers of moss. Whatever this place had been once, it hadn't been meant for visitors. He parked and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under his boots sounding unnaturally loud. The smell of damp earth and something metallic hung in the air. He switched on his recorder out of habit, though he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was already aware of him, listening. Ahead lay a path leading into the trees, narrow and winding, the kind of trail made not by hikers but by something moving repeatedly in the same direction. His pulse quickened as he stared into it. For a moment, he wondered why the fear gripping him felt less like instinct and more like memory, as if he'd been here before, walking toward something he had forgotten but should never have forgotten. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, he heard a single sound, a whisper, thin and distant, but unmistakably calling his name. And that was when he realized the locals had been wrong. It wasn't that no story was worth what he'd find here. It was that the story had already been waiting for him. The story begins with a seasoned reporter who has spent years chasing difficult assignments, the kind most journalists avoid because they require stepping into places where roads fade, records vanish, and locals guard their histories like guarded wounds. When his editor sends him to Appalachia to investigate a string of strange disappearances, he assumes it will be another bleak human interest piece, families in grief, police with no answers, and remote terrain swallowing evidence. But the deeper he reads into the preliminary notes, the more he senses something different about this case, something that unsettles him even before he arrives. These disappearances are scattered across decades, with victims who shared no clear connection, yet every incident took place somewhere along the ridges and hollows surrounding a region no longer listed by its original name. The locals refuse to acknowledge it, and the few online mentions feel like digital ghosts, half-erased posts, corrupted images, and threads abruptly ending mid-sentence, as if someone deleted them on purpose. Despite his initial unease, the reporter is driven by the stubborn instinct that has defined his career, the need to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it's buried. Appalachia has always carried a reputation for mystery, but is not the sort to be intimidated by landscapes or legends. What concerns him is the tone in his editor's voice when the assignment was handed over. It wasn't the usual enthusiasm for a gripping story. Instead, it sounded almost like obligation, as though the story had come to the newsroom from an external source, someone who wanted it investigated, someone who refused to let it remain forgotten. As he begins examining missing persons reports, he notices inconsistencies that shouldn't be there. Dates misaligned. Locations described differently by different officers. Statements from witnesses that contradict each other not because of human error, but because they seem to be describing entirely different scenes. The deeper he looks, the more he realizes the case files read less like official documents and more like fragments of a larger, fractured narrative. Every clue leads him to a dead end, except for one recurring detail, a place the families refer to only in passing, with visible discomfort, calling it the line. No coordinates. No explanation. Just that name, repeated quietly, as if speaking it too loudly would draw something unwanted. Instead of discouraging him, the mystery heightens his determination. He contacts local law enforcement, expecting resistance but hoping for at least a thread to pull. Instead, he encounters guarded faces, clipped responses, and a shared insistence that the disappearances were accidents or misunderstandings. Even so, they avoid mentioning the line entirely, which convinces him that whatever happened to those missing people is not only real but deliberately concealed. When the reporter finally arrives in the small Appalachian town closest to the disappearances, he expects the usual blend of caution and curiosity that locals often show toward outsiders, especially journalists. Instead, he encounters something far colder, something that feels less like distrust and more like quiet fear. The moment he introduces himself and mentions the purpose of his visit, conversations shut down abruptly. People who had been chatting on porches fall silent and retreat indoors. Store owners who were initially polite stiffen when he asks even the most basic questions about the missing individuals. He notices a pattern almost immediately. The instant he brings up the name he found scattered through the case files, the line, faces pale and eyes shift toward the forested hills as though expecting something to emerge at any moment. Hoping to ease their discomfort, he tries rephrasing his questions, avoiding loaded terms, but it makes no difference. The locals are not just unwilling to talk, they are terrified of talking. He meets a middle-aged man at a gas station who seems friendly enough at first, offering directions and commenting on the weather. But when the reporter casually mentions the disappearances, the man's jaw tightens. When he asks if the man has heard of a place called The Line, the man mutters a quick no, though his eyes betray recognition before he slams the gas pump back into place and hurries into his truck without another word. At the diner, he watches the waitress scribble down his order, her hand steady until he says he's in town to research the missing people. Her pen slips from her fingers. It takes her a full 5 seconds to pick it up, and when she does, she refuses to meet his gaze. She whispers to the cook, who stares at the reporter with a look that is not hostility but warning. Each interaction leaves him with the distinct impression that mentioning the disappearances is like touching an old wound the town has decided to ignore even as it continues to bleed. Later, as he walks down the main street, he approaches an elderly woman sweeping her porch. She watches him carefully, and he senses she knows more than most. But the moment he brings up the line, she stiffens and retreats into her house without a single word, shutting the door firmly behind her. He stands there for a moment, absorbing the heaviness of the silence she leaves behind. It becomes clear that this town is holding on to a collective secret, one they've agreed, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of survival, never to acknowledge aloud. The reporter realizes that whatever the line is, it isn't just a place on a map, it's something the entire community has sworn itself to avoid speaking about entirely. After hours of meeting nothing but closed doors, hurried excuses, and fearful glances, the reporter begins to wonder if he will ever get anyone to speak openly. The silence from the townspeople is so complete it feels rehearsed, as if every resident has taken part in the same unspoken pact. But just when he starts considering returning to his motel to regroup, he notices a figure watching him from the tree line at the edge of town. The man is weathered, with tangled hair and clothes that look as though they've seen years of rain, dirt, and solitude. He stands half-hidden behind a cluster of pines, observing with an intensity that makes the reporter pause. When the reporter approaches him cautiously, expecting the man to turn away like all the others, the stranger instead steps deeper into the woods and gives a small jerk of his head, silently beckoning him to follow. Against his better judgment, curiosity pushes him forward. The forest seems to swallow them as they walk, branches closing overhead and muting the sounds from town. After a few minutes, the hermit finally speaks, his voice rough and strained, as if unused to conversation. He tells the reporter he's been listening to him asking questions and warns that he won't find answers in town because the people there know better than to speak about the line. When the reporter asks if he knows anything about the disappearances, the hermit's eyes flick toward the deeper forest, and his shoulders tense in a way that suggests memory rather than imagination. He says he once lived among the townsfolk but left years ago after witnessing something no man should see, something that convinced him the others were right to stay silent. His warnings are not dramatic proclamations but whispered fragments, as though even the trees might overhear. He tells the reporter that there are places in the mountains where the ground feels older than the rest, where the air listens, and where sounds echo without any source. He insists that the missing people were not simply lost hikers or runaway drifters. Instead, he claims they were drawn by something that lives beyond the marked trails, something that doesn't tolerate being disturbed. When the reporter presses him for details, the hermit shakes his head, his voice breaking slightly as he tells him that the line is not a destination but a boundary, one that should never be crossed. Before the reporter can ask more, the hermit steps back, his eyes reflecting fear so deep it seems carved into him. He urges the reporter to leave Appalachia entirely, to forget the story, and to stop asking questions before he attracts the same attention that took the others. Then, without waiting for a response, the hermit disappears into the shadows of the forest, leaving the reporter alone with the lingering sense that this encounter was not just a warning but a plea. Following the unsettling encounter with the hermit, the reporter becomes even more determined to uncover whatever the townspeople are hiding. Fear has always been a signpost in his career. Wherever people are afraid to look, that's usually where the truth is buried. With the hermit's cryptic warning echoing in his mind, he turns back to the old case files, searching for any small detail he may have overlooked. Late into the night, he notices a pattern involving the locations where the missing individuals were last seen. Though each report names a different trail or hollow, all the spots circle around a single patch of dense wilderness that appears blank on every modern map. It strikes him as odd. There should at least be historical markings, geological notes, or remnants of old settlements, but the region is simply omitted. It's as if the land itself has been erased. Digging deeper, he finds references buried in archival records from the 1930s and 40s, mentioning a mining town that once existed in that same area. The town's name is unfamiliar, and when he searches for photographs or census data, he finds only one grainy newspaper clipping showing a row of small shacks beside a collapsed mine entrance. The article describes a sudden evacuation following a cave-in, but the language feels deliberately vague, avoiding specifics about casualties or what caused the collapse. The reporter senses the kind of intentional omission that usually signals liability, cover-ups, or events the authorities didn't want widely known. The next morning, he hikes toward the site, guided only by faded topographic sketches and a rough idea of where the town once stood. As he ventures deeper into the mountains, the trees grow thicker and the air heavier, but the quiet here is different from the silence in town. This quiet feels expectant, as though the mountains themselves are waiting for him. After several hours, he reaches a clearing and notices fragments of rusted metal poking through the soil, remains of old tools, building frames, and machinery half swallowed by decades of forest growth. The outlines of the abandoned mining town begin to take shape around him. He walks through the remnants slowly, noting footprints in the dirt that don't look decades old. Someone has been here recently. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, and a partially collapsed shack reveal signs of movement. There is no logical reason for anyone to visit a forgotten place like this unless they were searching for something or hiding from something else. As he steps near the old mine entrance, he feels a chill run through him at the sight of partial tracks leading toward the darkness inside, where faint scuff marks on the stone suggest that someone or something has been passing through even though the cave's support beams look ready to crumble. The realization that the abandoned town is not as abandoned as it should be settles on him like a weight, and he sees that the deeper he goes, the closer he gets to the truth the locals have tried desperately to bury. Inside the ruins of the forgotten mining town, the reporter feels as though he's stepping into a preserved pocket of time, a fading echo of lives abruptly interrupted. What catches his attention first is a half-collapsed structure that might once have been an office or storage building. Its windows are shattered, its door hanging from a single hinge, but beneath the layers of dust and fallen debris, he spots something incongruous, a wooden crate that looks far less weathered than everything around it. Curious, he kneels beside it and brushes away the grime. Inside, wrapped in brittle cloth that crumbles at his touch, he finds an old, leather-bound journal. The cover is cracked and faded, but the pages inside are surprisingly intact, preserved by the crate's protection from rain and pests. As he opens the journal, he realizes it dates back to the early 1940s. The handwriting is neat, though hurried in places, belonging to someone who clearly worked in the mining town. The early entries describe mundane life, weather conditions, daily routines, the camaraderie and frustrations among the miners. But buried a few pages in, the tone shifts abruptly. The writer begins describing strange sounds echoing from within the mine, low vibrations, whispers that seemed to travel through the stone itself. At first, the miners dismissed them as drafts or tricks of acoustics, but as days passed, the sounds began mimicking voices, sometimes familiar ones, sometimes entirely unrecognizable. One entry notes that a miner named Lal claimed he heard his late brother calling his name from deep inside the tunnels. Another describes a man waking in the night after hearing a voice outside his cabin repeating the exact words his daughter had spoken earlier that day. The deeper the reporter reads, the more the journal's accounts mirror the patterns of the modern disappearances. The writer speaks of men wandering off during their shifts, drawn by something they insisted was calling them. Some returned, dazed and unable to explain where they had been. Others were never found. The entries grow increasingly frantic as the writer describes markings appearing on the tunnel walls, symbols carved so deeply they seemed to predate the mining operation entirely. He speculates that the miners didn't uncover the sounds, they awakened them. A final, unfinished entry mentions a boundary the men discovered underground, a place where the rock felt unnaturally warm, and where the whispering became so loud it resembled many voices speaking at once. The reporter feels a chill as he realizes that the phenomenon the journal describes didn't die with the mining town. It aligns too perfectly with the recurring detail he's uncovered in the modern disappearances, individuals wandering off after claiming to hear something calling them from the woods. Holding the journal in his hands, he understands he's found his first real link between the past and the present, a connection the locals have tried for generations to suppress. As night settles over the abandoned mining town, the reporter sets up a small lantern inside one of the less collapsed shacks to read more of the journal. The forest outside is unnervingly still, the kind of silence that feels expectant rather than peaceful. He tells himself the unease pressing on him is only exhaustion from hours of hiking and investigation, but a growing sense of being observed makes concentration difficult. He rereads the entries describing miners hearing voices, sometimes their own loved ones, sometimes strangers. The details echo too closely the notes he found in the missing persons files, particularly the more recent accounts where family members mentioned their loved ones acting distracted, as if listening to something distant and private. The thought unsettles him, yet he continues reading, unaware that he's beginning to experience the same descent the journal describes. The first whisper he hears is barely a sound, more like a feeling brushing the edge of his awareness. At first he dismisses it as wind slipping through a crack in the wooden walls, but the night air outside is still and cold. A few minutes later, he hears it again, slightly clearer this time, a thin, wavering sound that seems to come from nowhere in particular. He pauses, listening. It stops. He returns to the journal, forcing himself to focus, but with each passing minute, the whisper returns, growing just distinct enough to resemble a shape, a cadence, something that could be a word. His pulse picks up as he strains to identify it, but the moment he tries to listen too closely, the sound slips away like breath on glass. He sets the journal down and turns off the lantern, trying to acclimate his ears to the darkness. The shack interior fades into blackness, but the whispering does not. This time, it is unmistakably a voice, faint but directed toward him. It repeats once, stretched thin by distance, yet shaped in a way that chills him instantly. It said his name. Not shouted, not spoken with urgency, just whispered, gently, almost coaxingly, as though inviting him to follow. He stumbles outside, breath catching in the cold air, and listens to the dense forest around him. The voice is gone, swallowed by the trees, but he can't shake the certainty that it had been real. He tries to rationalize it, fatigue, imagination, the power of suggestion after reading the journal. But deep down, he knows hallucinations don't call people by name. He thinks of the miners who followed the same echoes into the tunnels, of the missing individuals who wandered into the woods without explanation. The journal had warned that the voices begin softly, as a presence lingering at the edge of perception, growing stronger the more attention is paid to them. Standing alone in the darkness with the cold pressing against him, the reporter realizes he has crossed an invisible threshold. Whatever had spoken is aware of him now, just as it had been aware of the others before they vanished. Here are both explanations each 450 words no subheadings, no ending sentences, and each written as a separate continuous narrative. Key point number 6, 450 words As night settles over the abandoned mining town, the reporter decides to camp nearby, hoping the quiet will give him time to review the journal and gather his thoughts. But the stillness of the forest is not like the peaceful quiet is known in other remote places. This quiet feels layered, as if something is waiting beneath it, listening from a distance so close he can almost sense breath on the back of his neck. He tries to focus on the journal, rereading the pages about the voices in the mine, but the shadows cast by his lantern stretch strangely across the broken structures, as if bending toward him. Exhaustion eventually pushes him to lie down, but sleep refuses to come easily. Every time he closes his eyes, he sees flashes of the miners described in the journal wandering into darkness, following voices that didn't belong to the living. Sometime after midnight, he hears the faint rustling of leaves just beyond the edge of the clearing. At first, he assumes it's an animal. Then the sound shifts, becoming slower, heavier, and unmistakably deliberate. He sits up, straining to hear more, and that's when the whisper reaches him. It's soft, carried barely above the breeze, but the most chilling part is the familiarity. It speaks his name. Not simply in a generic echo, but in the exact cadence used by someone from his past, someone whose voice he hasn't heard in years. He freezes, every instinct telling him the sound is wrong, not just because no one should know he's here, but because the tone carries an uncanny imitation, as though whatever is speaking has heard the name spoken before and is now attempting to repeat it. He steps outside his tent, flashlight trembling in his hand, scanning the tree line. The whisper comes again, closer this time, but still impossible to locate. It seems to shift positions, jumping from one side of the clearing to the other, as if circling him. The cold air thickens, and he feels a pressure in his ears, like altitude sickness. His breath quickens. He calls out, trying to convince himself that someone may be playing a cruel joke, but the forest offers no reply except the whisper, now softer, almost coaxing. The reporter backs toward the center of the clearing, forcing himself not to run, though instinct screams at him to flee. When the whisper finally stops, the silence that follows is somehow even more unnerving, as if whatever was calling him is still present, waiting for him to listen again. ****** Key point number 7, 450 words ****. The next morning, drained and jittery from lack of sleep, the reporter decides to investigate the mine itself, hoping that confronting the source of the journal's entries might help him make sense of what he heard during the night. The mine entrance looms like a ragged mouth in the hillside, framed by rotting beams and creeping roots. With every step toward it, the temperature drops, and the air feels thick with a mineral tang that clings to his throat. The reporter switches on his flashlight and steps inside, the beam cutting through dust motes suspended like ash. The interior walls bear the scars of decades-old pick strikes and machinery marks, but beneath them he notices strange carvings, almost identical to those described in the journal. They spiral in patterns that make no immediate sense, carved so deep they look like they were etched by something with far more strength than human hands. The deeper he goes, the more he feels the oppressive weight of the mountain pressing inward. His footsteps echo unevenly, as if the sound is being distorted or pulled in different directions. A few hundred feet in, he discovers a narrow passage partially blocked by fallen support beams. Beneath them he notices scratch marks on the stone floor, not animal scratches, but long, furrowed grooves that suggest something large was dragged or moved through the passage recently. Heart pounding, he squeezes through the gap, ignoring the uneasy feeling that the stones themselves seem warmer the farther he advances, radiating a faint heat that shouldn't exist underground. At the end of the passage, he finds what the journal hinted at, a hidden chamber. It's small but domed, carved out with a precision inconsistent with mining tools. The walls are covered in the same symbols, but here they appear more deliberate, almost ritualistic. His flashlight flickers, and for a moment he thinks he sees movement or shadow in the corner of his vision. He steadies the beam and records everything, describing the symbols into his device. But then he notices the acoustics. The chamber carries no echo. Every sound he makes is swallowed instantly, as if the air absorbs it. Then, without warning, his recorder picks up a faint sound behind him. A slow exhale. A shift of gravel. He turns sharply, but nothing is there. Only the darkness beyond his beam. He lifts the recorder, and the device captures another sound, something like a voice trying to form words it hasn't quite learned to pronounce. The sound is wrong, too fluid, too eager, too close. The reporter realizes with growing dread that whatever the miners encountered here didn't stay underground. It learned to move, to mimic, to listen. And now, it has found something new to follow. *** key point 6, 450 words, no subheadings, ***. After discovering the miner's journal and recognizing its disturbing resemblance to the modern disappearances, the reporter tries to convince himself that the eerie entries are simply the product of isolation, exhaustion, or superstition. But as night settles over the abandoned mining town, he begins to experience something that makes denial impossible. At first, it's nothing more than a faint sound, a whispering so soft he mistakes it for the wind threading through the collapsed structures. Yet the longer he listens, the clearer it becomes that the sound isn't random. It carries rhythm, cadence, intent. He freezes, holding his breath, and that's when he hears it unmistakably, a whisper speaking his name. Not shouted, not growled, but spoken the way someone might call across a dim room, familiar, almost gentle, but with an undercurrent that makes his skin crawl. He tries to rationalize it as an echo, perhaps even his own breathing catching strangely in the cold air. But then it comes again, closer this time, threading through the ruined buildings like a living thing. By the time he returns to his truck, he's unsettled enough to question whether he should continue. He tells himself fatigue might be playing tricks on him. Yet as he drives back toward town, the whispers seem to follow, drifting in and out as though carried by currents of air that have no natural source. That night in his motel room, he lies awake staring at the ceiling, trying to drown out the memory of that voice. He eventually drifts into an uneasy sleep, only to wake with a jolt hours later. The room is still and cold, the kind of cold that feels intentional. For a moment he thinks he might be dreaming, but then he hears the whisper again, soft, deliberate, coming from the corner of the room where no one stands. When he switches on the lamp, the sound stops instantly, the silence returning with a weight that makes the air feel thick. He tries to replay the journal's entries in his mind, wondering if the miners had heard the same voice, the same unnatural mimicry that seemed to awaken only at night. As dawn approaches, the reporter attempts to regain his composure, but the whispering refuses to be dismissed as imagination. What unsettles him most is how the voice seems to grow more distinct with each passing day, as if learning him, memorizing him. He realizes the journal wasn't simply recounting eerie events, it was documenting stages of something progressive, something that starts as faint murmurs and grows into something that takes hold of its listener. And now, he fears, he has stepped onto the same path that consumed the miners and the missing townspeople, a path he may no longer be able to walk away from. *** key point 7, 450 words, no subheadings, ***. The reporter returns to the abandoned mining site the next day, driven by a mix of fear and the relentless instinct to understand what he's now experiencing. The voice that whispered to him in the darkness feels less like a hallucination and more like a clue he is compelled to follow. With the journal in hand, he studies the miners' descriptions of strange markings found deep within the tunnels, symbols carved into rock long before miners ever set foot inside. The journal's author wrote that these symbols formed a pattern, a boundary of sorts, and crossing beyond them marked the point where the whispers intensified. Intrigued, the reporter follows the narrow path leading back to the mine's entrance, his flashlight slicing through the gloom. The cave feels colder than before, as though something inside has been anticipating his return. As he steps beyond the threshold, the air becomes unnaturally still. His beam of light catches scrawled symbols on the stone walls, just as the journal described, deep grooves forming shapes he can't interpret, shapes that seem less like human handwriting and more like the markings of something ancient. The arrangement feels intentional, boundary-like. His pulse quickens as he steps farther in, guided by curiosity and dread in equal measure. Deeper inside the mine, the shapes multiply, covering the rock in twisting arcs and jagged lines that seem to pulse faintly in the corner of his vision. At the center of a broad chamber, half hidden beneath fallen beams, he discovers a narrow fissure leading downward, almost like a vertical wound in the earth. The moment he leans closer, a rush of cold air surges upward, carrying a sound that stops him in his tracks. It isn't the whisper this time, it's something worse. A voice, unmistakably human, repeating his name in the exact tone his mother used when she needed him as a child. Every instinct in him screams to back away, But the voice is so precise, so intimate, that it feels like a trap designed from memory itself. His throat tightens as the journal's final entries echo in his mind, describing how the miners heard familiar voices in the final days before their disappearance. Voices of loved ones, voices of people long dead, voices that lured them deeper and deeper. He steadies himself and forces his light deeper into the fissure, hoping to see what lies within. But all he sees is darkness, thick, swallowing, shifting slightly as though something inside is breathing. The voice continues calling him, gentle, coaxing, patient. In that moment, the reporter realizes he has found the boundary mentioned in the journal. And he understands why those who crossed it never returned the same. Key point 8, 450 words, no subheadings, ***. Shaken from the encounter in the mine, the reporter leaves the site with trembling hands, clutching his recorder and backpack as if they could anchor him to reality. But he doesn't get far before another disturbing discovery stops him. While reviewing the audio from his trip inside the mine, hoping to capture evidence of the whispered voices, he hears something he didn't notice in the moment. On the recording, after his own footsteps fade, there is a voice speaking softly from somewhere behind him. It's not the familiar voice that called to him from the fissure. This one is distorted, layered, as though several voices are speaking in unison, all echoing a single phrase he can't quite understand. The sound makes his skin crawl. It is neither fully human nor fully animal, but something trying to imitate speech with unsettling precision. He rewinds the audio again and again, each playback confirming the same chilling presence. Something was in the chamber with him, hidden in the dark, speaking words he wasn't meant to hear. As he walks back toward the outskirts of the abandoned town, he becomes increasingly aware that he is not alone. Twigs snap behind him at irregular intervals, never close enough for him to see who or what is following, but timed too deliberately to be coincidence. Each time he stops, the forest goes silent, the same weighted stillness he felt in the mine settling over him. It's as if the woods themselves are holding their breath. When he moves again, the sound resumes, subtle but consistent. He records everything, but the microphone captures only his own footsteps and the wind, never the presence he feels just out of sight. The deeper he moves into the forest, the louder the feeling becomes, a pressure, a watchfulness, a sense that he has crossed into a place where human rules no longer apply. Then, abruptly, the whispering begins again, this time much closer. Not from the mine, not from behind him, but from both sides of the trail. Left. Right. Surrounding him. Some whispers mimic his own voice. Others take on the tone of strangers. But the worst ones imitate the voices of people he hasn't heard in years, people he believed he had forgotten. One whisper speaks a sentence he once said in childhood, repeating it with perfect accuracy. The realization hits him like a blow. Whatever is following him isn't just mimicking voices, it is learning him, studying his rhythms, gathering pieces of who he is. He breaks into a run, desperate to reach open terrain, but the whispers keep pace with him, growing louder, overlapping until they form an almost conversational murmur. By the time he bursts through the last line of trees, gasping for breath, he understands that what he encountered in the mine is not confined to the tunnels. It moves freely in the mountains, following those who wander too close. And now, it has found him. The reporter's growing obsession with the mystery leads him to take risks he normally wouldn't consider. After weeks of documenting the area, reviewing his recordings, and retracing the steps of the missing, he begins noticing patterns that are impossible to ignore. He realizes that certain trails, hollows, and abandoned structures share the same markings, the same irregularities in the terrain that he had previously dismissed as natural anomalies. Each discovery seems to pull him deeper into a network of locations tied together not by geography but by some unseen force, something that has existed long before the town, long before the mountains themselves were mapped. He senses that the answers he seeks are within reach, yet the weight of the unknown presses heavily on his mind, a constant hum at the edge of perception. One night, driven by a mix of dread and determination, he records a final message for his editor. His voice is tense, bordering on panic, as he recounts the oddities he has observed, the sounds that appear to have no source, the footprints that vanish without a trace, the symbols carved into the stone that seem to resonate with some invisible energy. He explains that the disappearances are not random, nor are they accidents. There is a pattern, a deliberate pull, a force that lures people into the wilderness. He warns that he himself has begun hearing the same whispers the missing claimed, faint at first, then growing clearer each night, calling him by name, echoing through the trees in ways that defy explanation. The reporter's words tremble with urgency, as if he can feel the presence of whatever has haunted these mountains drawing nearer with each passing hour. He tells his editor not to search for him if he stops sending updates, pleading that the danger is not only real but persistent, waiting in the shadows for anyone foolish enough to follow. As soon as the message is recorded, he ventures out toward the line one last time, driven by the compulsion that has gripped him since he first set foot in the forest. He leaves behind his notes, his maps, and all the belongings that connect him to the ordinary world, carrying only the recorder and a small pack of essentials. Each step he takes seems heavier than the last, and the air grows colder, thicker, as if resisting his passage. By the time anyone could hope to locate him, he is already engulfed by the forest, moving toward the heart of the mystery, leaving behind only the faintest impressions of his presence. Later, the only evidence that he had ever been there at all is the recorder, found abandoned near the edge of the woods, still running. Its playback captures the sound of footsteps approaching and receding, of breath that is no longer his, and faint whispers that seem to call for him from unseen corners, echoing the chilling reality of the fate that claimed him, leaving those who listen with a sense of dread they cannot shake. Before anyone could respond to the reporter's frantic final message, the inevitable happens. The forest that had long seemed to watch him, patient and knowing, finally closes around him completely. He sets out early in the morning, carrying only his recorder and notebook, drawn by the same compulsion that had gripped every missing person he had been investigating. The path he follows is familiar in some ways, marked by broken branches and faint footprints he had seen before, yet with every step the environment feels more alien, more oppressive, as though the mountains themselves are shifting to guide him deeper into their hidden heart. The sunlight fades behind thick canopies of trees, and the air grows colder, heavier, as if carrying the memory of those who disappeared before him. Hours pass, and with each one, the whispers grow clearer. At first, they mimic distant voices, barely audible, but gradually they evolve into tones he recognizes, fragments of conversations he had with the hermit, the gas station attendant, and even echoes of the family's interviews. The sounds wrap around him, indistinguishable from the wind, yet impossible to ignore. They call him by name, coaxing him onward, demanding he follow. He hesitates briefly at the edge of a rocky ravine, staring into darkness so profound it seems to swallow sound, but the compulsion is irresistible. Every instinct tells him to turn back, yet every rational thought is overpowered by the force drawing him forward. He steps into the ravine, and the forest seems to respond, branches tightening like fingers along his path, roots rising to trip him, shadows stretching unnaturally across the terrain. He continues, each step echoing off the rock walls, and notices footprints appearing beside his own, though no one else is visible. His breath becomes rapid, matching the cadence of the whispers, until he reaches a cavernous opening partially hidden by undergrowth. The air inside is warmer, damp, and carries a metallic tang, and the symbols he had documented in the abandoned mine appear etched into the walls here as well, pulsating faintly, almost imperceptibly, under his flashlight. The realization strikes him that this is the source, the heart of whatever has been calling, luring, consuming. He reaches out to touch one of the symbols, and the whispers escalate into a chorus of voices, a cacophony that presses against his skull. His last recorded words are a mix of awe and terror, a frantic recognition that he now understands what the disappeared encountered. Then silence. The forest absorbs him completely, leaving behind only his recorder lying on the edge of the ravine. When it is discovered days later, it continues to capture sound, footsteps that don't match his, breathing that is heavier, deeper, and faint whispers that repeat his name, as though the mountains themselves are keeping him, transforming him into another fragment of the mystery that has haunted Appalachia for generations.